Okay, we're going to get going. This is Concurrency's conversation about mergers and acquisitions and your Office 365 tenant. This was last week presented as a 3-hour session. So we have worked assertively to compress a 3-hour session's content into an hour-long M&A event. We may or may not be successful at that, but we are going to do our best to make sure that we present as much valuable information in a compressed period of time. We're also going to assertively take advantage of chat. So as you are joining and you are having questions about different domains, the non-speaker will be answering questions within the chat and complimenting the person who's speaking at the time. So please take advantage of that. We've found it to be a really nice way for us to be able to answer detailed questions as we go, and to then leave some time at the end as well for some of those conversations. But as they come up, put them out there. We'll start hitting them. So what we're going to do here is walk through a whole series of different aspects of mergers and acquisitions in the context of Office 365. And we're going to start with introducing who it is that's talking to you today. So I'll start. My name is Nathan Lesnowski. I'm Concurrency's Chief Technology Officer. I've been in consulting for 21 years. I'm a 13-time Microsoft MVP. I also have a lot of interest in competitive sports, do a lot of triathlons. I have 8 kids. They participate in triathlons as well. And one of the things that I've learned as a result of this is that I'm never the fastest person and I'm never the smartest person, but usually have something to add to the conversation. And oftentimes now I'm being beat by my daughter. So this is, I think, a representation of like why I find this really exciting conversation today, is because we've learned a lot over the last several years around mergers and acquisitions, especially Office 365. And Chris and I have the battle scars to, I guess, to live through that. So we're going to be sharing a lot of those with you today. So nice to meet everyone. And Chris?
Thank you, Nate. Appreciate it. Also been in the consulting space for 20 plus years. I'm a solution architect here, Concurrency on our modern workplace team. Really covers everything from hybrid cloud, identity, collaboration, security, compliance, and endpoint management. So all those get bundled up and actually are a part of this M&A strategy. All those have to come into consideration. So that's why we're excited to be talking with you today. When I'm not behind the keyboard doing the IT stuff, I'm traveling. I'm the DJ. I love trying new foods around the world. I'll be doing that quite a bit in the last month. In the next month, about a month from today, I'll actually be in the Netherlands and the Iceland before that. So excited to try some new stuff.
That's awesome. All right. So we're going to kick this off by diving into an understanding of M&A in the context of why, what, how, and then we'll start talking about some of the specifics of this. So our intent here is to make sure you get some of this kind of broad down to the details. By the way, one thing I would suggest is connect with us on LinkedIn. We'd love to talk with you after this. We'd also love to just to know who's here and be part of your community. So we are one of the reasons we do this is because we think that everyone's better off if we share the information that we know. So certainly make that connection as well. Okay, so let's just start really briefly with a walkthrough of the types of M&A that we are even talking about, because there are so many different scenarios, but we'll really focus on a couple of these as the main stories today. So there's really 4 different types of M&A that we tend to run into with companies trying to integrate their organizations, especially specific to Office 365 and Azure. So the first of these is this number 1, which is a divestiture, which is a scenario where an organization takes their current business and splits it in 2. We have worked with many organizations to accomplish this, and it's one of the more tremendous opportunities that companies have because they get to start over. Divestitures are opportunities for an organization to build up an entirely new infrastructure and to be able to build that in a way that kind of meets the things that they're really interested in that looking like, and with the efficiencies and goals that they have for creating an opportunity. The reason why a company does that is they're intending to get value by being separate. And then they believe that they will receive more value by being separate than the value that they get together. So an example of that happened over time was Brunswick split from Brunswick, the boating company, and Brunswick, the life fitness organization. They broke into two, and those organizations then had the opportunity to grow separately rather than try to grow as a whole. The second scenario here is what's called a carve out, which is where a company adopts B, but in like a data centric way, like they're grabbing a part of an application or a service or a piece of data or IP, and they're integrating that into an application or a platform that they are running. And that tends to be one that is very valuable and very useful, but it tends to be a little bit simpler from a IT standpoint and acquisition standpoint. And that sort of fits in the picture as well. This next one, number 3, would be a full company acquisition where A and B become a new company, and usually it's being integrated into one of them. One is generally substantially bigger than the other, so typically A would be significantly larger than what B would be, and B becomes part of A's organization. And you might have so for example, you might have an organization of 10,000 people that gets integrated by there's an organization that they acquire of say 2,000 people. They're being brought into that organization, and that tends to follow a very repeatable pattern of how those organizations are integrated, because one of those companies is largely in charge. They have the ability to be able to make the decisions. The more complicated scenario is when it's somewhat of a merger of equals. Two companies are relatively the same size. This comes up a lot for us where those companies may have a new name after the project is completed. And in both of these cases, the company is making a decision that the combined company is more valuable than running these organizations separately, that there are synergies between those organizations. And especially in number 4, the synergies are such that they may even be defining an entirely new company name and brand that represents those synergies. So the reason I take the time to go through these and to really pause here is to say the main goal of all of this is to achieve value for the organization. And the reason why we're doing this M&A activity is to facilitate that value being realized in as small of a period as possible. So when you look at the typical M&A process, you see that there's this near-term activity that happens pre-close. Sometimes you may not even know that's happening. A lot of times you're getting involved right here, right in the phase 3 stage where you're starting to build the integration plan and intake them into your organization. Sometimes you're getting integrated here in phase 2 to do due diligence or t-shirt sizing associated with investment that needs to get allocated to the M&A process. So ultimately, the goals associated with that are to reduce the time to value of the integration. This is the number one thing that your business is asking of you, is how do I integrate these two organizations together and get value faster? But then in conjunction with that, not interrupting the production process of both organizations. That we had a closure of a project yesterday with an organization, and one of the things they said was, man, like one of the things I'm most proud about as a result of this integration is that we never really interrupted production in a negative way. I didn't have escalations about the production process for our manufacturing or our workers say, man, you're preventing us from being able to build the products that we sell to our customers. So that relationship between time to integration, but also not interrupting the production process is a really important balance associated with those two goals. Number 3 is this understanding of mitigating security risks. Many organizations that get acquired are smaller. If we were just going to be transparent, a lot of those organizations are less well run than the parent organization's security program. And there's a significant need to apply security controls to those very early on to prevent the parent organization, the new acquirer, from getting compromised, but then also throughout the integration, as well as or disintegration from that becoming an issue that takes advantage of the organization. We've certainly seen organizations where that's been the case, where the acquired company has a significant compromise because of the state of their originating organization. Number 4 is a goal to modernize the environment while this all happens. And that's something Chris is going to talk a lot about. And then also gaining efficiencies as a result of that integration. These all things go together as a relationship between the M&A and its relationship to technology as a part of the integration. So when we think about this, think about how you can complement that M&A with technology. The most successful companies modernize during integration, which is somewhat counterintuitive, but it's absolutely something that we found, is that the companies that succeed most are the ones that go toward a North Star as part of the integration strategy. And they know that provides them the opportunity to leverage the funding as well as intentionality tied to that M&A to accomplish an end goal. So that means you have to understand where you're taking your architecture as an organization. You have to match that to your M&A approach that ties your target architecture to the end game technology. And oftentimes retaining the legacy approach is actually slower. So for example, migrating a user and all their content as is a lot slower than adopting a modern desktop approach. And oftentimes the user experience is much worse following that legacy approach as well.
Right. Short-term pain or long-term gain, right?
Exactly. So let's dive into 1 to 180, Chris.
Perfect. I will take over the steering wheel as we continue down this journey of talking about, I say miles per hour in a lot of cases with customers. It's 180 days. Sometimes it's longer. We'll talk about that in the course of the next few sections on speed. But we want to start about a bit of nomenclature as we kind of look at some of these slides. You'll see these terms, old co, spin co, new co, kind of come up. But just think of old co, that's that source organization. Spinco is really that target organization, and Newco, those can either be a new company, or in some cases with projects that we're dealing with, those are actually organizations where they come together under a new name, a new umbrella. And those, from a complexity perspective, can add a lot to these projects. And so as we look at typical scenarios that we at Concurrency have worked with, there's really 2 common ones that we see. Old co is ingested into Spinco, and they adopt that name. Probably one of the easiest approaches, versus Spinco and Oldco deciding that, hey, they want to have a new name. Let's say we, as IT professionals, are brought into this project. We find that a new company is merging with ours. They're 2 about the same size, but they are going to go under a new umbrella, and we need to be able to portray that name to customers, to end users, to whomever in a very short time frame. And so, as we kind of look at that process, I wanted to kind of provide 2 different illustrations on kind of the ease with going from the old acquisition of that old co, and we kind of spin that old co into the Spinco company, and we set up licensing, we do email forwarding, we sometimes will use a third-party tool to give them in their existing tenant that same email address as that target organization, and then eventually we migrate their collaboration, their end-user computing experience. Usually this is kind of one of those first phases of the project, and we'll talk about that in a minute, what that looks like. To integrate that acquisition and have that Spinco and Oldco use the same name, we have to spin up a tenant. We have to provision that domain name, and sometimes we just add that domain name to the existing environment. One thing to kind of keep in mind too here is email reputation. That reputation can take a long time to be built, and so we've seen customers that go down this approach, throw up a couple red flags and say, it's a great approach, but you have to build that spam confidence around the globe with all the email providers throughout the course of this process. And so, as we kind of look at that step 4, we start to give those users those email accounts. We set up forwarding in some cases, and then later on, we're moving that old co into Spinco, but they've been able to email out as that newco.com domain name throughout the course of this integration process. So we're starting to see that more and more of a process just because from a customer facing perspective, it looks a lot better for two large organizations that come together as one. So that's typically one of those first projects. And then second of all, that conversation as we start to do integration of old co into spin co, we start to look at licensing. How is licensing approach to be able to bring those users into the organization? And so, the three most common ones that we see is we just add users to their existing enterprise licensing agreement. If you're a large organization, you're familiar with that is. If you're a smaller organization, you're probably familiar with the CSP. You've got a cloud solution provider that you reach out to, you ask for some more licenses, they provision them. It allows you to kind of go through this cycle of easily ramping up and ramping down. If you're an organization that has a lot of seasonal changes, CSP is definitely a great model because you can have one user be licensed for a few months, and then the fall or maybe even the winter comes along, you can ramp them down. Versus EA, you're having to true up. So definitely some benefits and drawbacks for both of those. For organizations that do have an EA, there's this thing called a bridge agreement. So Microsoft will let you, from a period of 90 to 180 days, and in some cases a little bit longer if you both have EAs, to take EAs from your old co environment and add it to your spin co tenant to essentially have those same licenses for that period of time. That usually allows that flexibility to still have that spending from licensing occur in both environments and be able to, at the end of that migration process, essentially all be in one EA. So those are the three that usually we have as conversations after we've gone through and started to talk about that name, that email, and then as part of this whole component, while we are doing that quick spin up as part of that 1 to 180, we are looking at building that M&A factory. And that usually is comprised of some directional phases. That spin up, as we just talked about, as well as that usually happens around the same time as that high level planning to be able to look at what are we going to be doing in moving users and moving their collaboration and moving their devices. How does that impact my apps, my files, my data center, my cloud resources? All those all come into play as part of looking at that planning exercise that occurs across each of these different work streams. But the core component of a lot of the M&As really does occur in that phase two. That's going to be where we are moving email out of a tenant. We're moving chat conversations, team sites, SharePoint sites, as well as looking at the end user compute environment. How are we going to migrate those into our domain name, into our tenant long term? And that same conversation occurs about applications. How are we going to move those from tenant A to tenant B if it's single sign-on? How are we going to uplift legacy applications that are connected to Active Directory, that have SQL servers? Those are all conversations that happen in phase one, but we want to do that planning early so we're not caught off surprise in phase two or phase three. And then having that goal of when you want to decom Active Directory, decom your tenant, is something to plan for in the beginning. Otherwise, we've seen customers where that can go on for years after this project has occurred. And so as we look at each of the work streams that comprise each of these different phases of an M&A, we can see there's a lot of core tenets that I spoke about early on as I was introducing Modern Workplace around identity, collab, and user compute. But then we also have data center and applications. From a perspective of security, Nathan also mentioned as part of that ramp up, we want to be mindful of security because we don't want to acquire a company and then find out that they were bad on security. They have some sort of bad actor event and then they get in the news. So typically from day one, we'll see that cybersecurity assessment happen in the beginning. We provision identity and collaboration after that. And then we start to talk about the migration process of that and user compute, data center, and applications. If we were to break down each of these into that factory in the directional phases, we would typically see these exist as that phase one for doing the assessment, quickly ramping up how we're going to leverage email, what we're going to do to either have the same name or forwarding or some sort of domain rewrite, and then really start to dive into phase two, planning and migrating collaboration and user computing. And then as those migration waves are occurring, starting to look at how we're going to plan and migrate into phase four. And then as we can kind of see, we really will then, as we do some of that discovery within each of those work streams, and we start to put together that plan of what can we do right now to mitigate any gaps in how both of those organizations exist. What are we going to do in that next state of that current state of being able to get those devices into that long-term state? And then what's the long-term view look like? Where are there opportunities to transform how we are working as an IT organization during the course of this integration project? And then being able to break out each of those efforts within their own work stream, within their own timeline, and then wrap that with an organizational change management. At the end of the day, this factory, as we start to look at M&As, really does occur a lot like a program. And if you're looking at doing an M&A, now don't just look at the email portion or the PC portion. It really is a whole program, and that factory concept of moving through each of those different phases of the project is very important.
Yeah, just to interject there, I think that's the thing that most companies are surprised by, is the number of related components that they have to think about to be successful at these M&As. Like, when we get in these conversations, often like unrealistic expectations of when they're going to have integration done, or isn't this easy? We're just moving email, but it's really a relationship between all these different elements of the work stream, and understanding that in the context of short-term, midterm, long-term, and then moving that into how you actually then take action. And that really goes back to that original graphic of the, phases that have to be accomplished in order for you to be successful at this.
I think when we were at the conference, you were thinking of this particular illustration, weren't you?
Yes, yes.
So there's a lot that goes on at the same time, and if you don't treat it as a program, it's not only gonna drive you and IT crazy, but it's going to drive the business a little crazy as well. So definitely keep that in mind as you go throughout this planning exercise in discovery. So this is very important at the very front end, to being able to gain insight into all these different components, on-prem, cloud, how your apps work together, where your data is, how they're using relational databases like SQL, and then what's in the Microsoft cloud. We leverage, and even Quest as well leverages this enterprise reporter for a lot of M&As to be able to go out and do a spider web into each of these environments to look to see what type of data is there, to be able to provide you with these reports. In a lot of cases, as we work with M&As, the acquiring company may not have that relationship with that IT department. That IT department might have gone through some changes. That IT department might have seen some people depart upon that acquisition. So being able to be on the same playing field as those people that are coming into your organization, that you're acquiring, that are going to become a part of your IT team is important. And that's why a tool like the Enterprise Portal will give you a plethora of different reports where you can look at some data under the covers without having to spend months and months and months in discovery, and then being able to jump in to some of the planning, because it will provide you those reports at your fingertips. And as you look at that data, as you start to think about the decisions that you have to make, this really does become the most important part of the journey as you build out that plan, because a lot of uplifts usually aren't one-to-one. It's how do we take this opportunity to make enterprise IT better than before, make our organization better, the organization that we are acquiring, they become better as well. Having these data points are very crucial to how you start to then build out your playbook, which we'll talk about here very shortly. But as we look at some of the decisions that have to be made, the tooling options, this is one decision where, looking at Microsoft versus Quest, Microsoft has some tool sets that they're starting to mature. There's really little to no cost behind them, but the implementation time, as well as the caveats behind them, which we'll touch on a little bit, do come into play. And so usually as we look at licensing costs and the implementation time in a mature tool set, that's where things like Quest really does a fantastic job in making this whole process a lot smoother. And it allows us to be able to leverage things like email coexistence. Do we want our users in old code to be able to start emailing out as my organization as SpinCo from day one without having to log into an extra mailbox and having a negative experience. And so, this is typically what some of that workflow looks like. At the end, you can see, your source environment. You can still, as you reply out, that may still go out as your old source environment. But in most cases, what we see is our customers, they will have any email as at a point in time of demarcation. Sorry, I was trying to find a little drawing tool, but my toolbar seems to be hiding it. We'll see organizations will, as at a certain point in time, they'll start to email out as that target environment even before we start any of the integration experience, which we talked about a little bit earlier. This is a real high level workflow and how Quest Tool can provide some of that domain coexistence to be able to allow that outbound emailing to occur.
This
And so
tends to
those
be
are
like the
usually some of the,
obvious first
go ahead,
step,
Nate.
right? Yeah, just
Yeah,
this tends to be the obvious first step, like that
yes,
companies want.
these two are usually conversations that we're having almost immediately as we walk into a planning phase of a project. So then we can get to some of the harder decisions. How do we go and we integrate our email? How do we integrate our workstations? Usually, as you look at, as we talked with customers, some of them will have a longer refresh cycle. They'll go with that option 2, where they move all of their collaboration first, and then at some point down the line, a workstation will be replaced. It'll be refreshed. And within a lot of organizations, that's just not feasible because there's a lot of impact that that'll have with single sign-on, access to applications, etc. And so it's a little bit more work. It's higher preparation, higher user impact, but then kind of that long-term support seems to be a little bit lower when we do those together. And so as we look at some of the next slides, one of the things to kind of think about too is that concept of short-term gain or long-term pain. Do we want to make these changes quickly so the end user can continue to work, or do we want to draw these out so that as part of a conversion, this source organization may say, well, we're years 2 into this migration and now we're waiting for our apps to be moved. We see it. It happens. And so that's the thing to be mindful of as we think about some of these consolidated work streams as well as the PC migration options. There's a number of them that can come into play here. This first column here on the left, it's do we replace a workstation? Do we reset it? Both, which are Microsoft supported. It was just on a call with the product team earlier today, and it was a spicy one because you see option 3 where a lot of the customers have requirements to move those workstations without impacting, to do no harm. And it's not Microsoft supported, but there are tools that we use as part of these M&As, as part of moving workstations into the cloud that we do leverage. But Microsoft will be the first to say it's not supported. But we all know in the business world, sometimes what we see and how Microsoft sees aren't necessarily eye to eye. So I wanted to call those out as what feasible options are there for the workstation migration process. And then it's, how do we move the migration? How do we migrate that machine into that new organization? Do we go right into Azure AD join in the cloud and make it cloud managed and avoid that double migration of devices? Or do we hybrid AD join it now and then long-term have to migrate it into Azure AD? We're starting to see more organizations embrace number 1. There's still some of the larger ones that kind of go by that number 2 approach, but we do caveat and warn them that that will mean more work long-term when they can do it now and avoid it later. As well as within,
I'm just going to say, I want to share a story on that one right there. A lot of times when companies are thinking about hybrid join devices, there's this concern that like all this stuff, group policies and scripts and this and that we have to go through in order to get to that end game of option 1, and it slows it all down and becomes all these roadblocks. We just ran into a couple companies where like they had a significant disaster or a ransomware or whatever, and in that company they moved to cloud join PCs really rapidly and accomplished a very simple deployment pattern associated with it by thinking toward the solution rather than thinking about all the things that were blocking them from getting there. And that deployment pattern was drastically faster than the approaches associated with option 2. And I realize there's a compelling event to get there, but it's still something that like really think hard about whether we can move to an end game that we can operate more efficiently than trying to drag along the boat anchor.
and that also kind of comes into play too with organizations as they look to move to kind of cloud management, cloud first management, moving away from configuration manager. This is a great event to help drive that forward as well, to be able to sunset that on-premises infrastructure for managing deployment and move it all into the cloud. Intune has been, I would say, production ready since 2019, 2020, and it's just continued to get bigger. And that gap between what's in on-prem config man and in the cloud just continues to get wider and wider. And there's a lot of really great tools that you can leverage in the cloud that you can't leverage on-prem as well. So that's usually an opportunity, as well as within moving into that modern managed state, looking at autopilot. It's a much simpler process. It's a little more user driven. It's definitely a little bit of a paradigm shift, but being able to drop ship a machine anywhere, have it all provisioned without having to take up some of those cycles of IT is another great driver, and why we see organizations using an opportunity like an M&A to transform their desktop deployment experience and leverage autopilot. And so as we look at integration at 10,000 feet, I know we looked at those work streams. We kind of talked about that phase one of planning out a tool set, looking at how we handle mail flow, being able to plan out per work stream, and then really taking that next step and building out that migration factory, how we're going to leverage Intune or device management to migrate devices, how we're going to manage our collaboration experience and migrate it, being able to do some of that validation testing, go through organizational change management, and then have that migration run book, different than playbook. It's a run book, how we actually execute the migration versus how we look at the migration. This is where that run book will help both not only your organization, but if you're working with a partner like Concurrency, ensure that we are executing exactly how it was planned out, how it was communicated as well. And then we start to target those migration waves. Sometimes with organizations, there are a few. With others, it can take months to execute, just because we want to make sure that that support cycle and that organizational change management is effective. And then at the very end, once devices are migrated, we ensure that they can coexist with the old environment. We then will move file servers, we'll move applications, we'll migrate servers, and then be able to look at sunsetting that Active Directory environment. And then from an integration schedule, this one's a pretty aggressive one that we were talking with the customer regarding, not only from going through the process of finalizing a statement of work, going through the discovery, preparing those quest tools, but then going through and preparing that migration process, building out that run book, doing the testing, doing some transformation into Intune, and leveraging that for being able to do deployments, and then really executing against migration waves, whether that's using a tool to migrate computers at the same time as collaboration, or putting new devices in end users' hands, and then once they turn on those devices for the first time, having that collaboration experience kind of stream down. And then finally, at the very end, that data center, which is apps, files, servers, moving into that target environment. So, from an aggressive timeline, it takes a lot of resources. This is why it's a program, and having adequate time for a successful integration is very important to consider as well. But then as we have that run book, that playbook, being able to spell out at a high level as you go into a project, what's going to occur at this point within the process, being able to have that run book to show how each of those steps execute will allow your organization to be able to take this process, this factory, and repeat it. Acquire another company. You've got that repeatable process. And that's where we've been successful in engaging with customers. Having that migration runbook, having that migration playbook helps them to feel confident in continuing to grow their organization through acquisition by having a set process. So we talked a lot about the 1 to 180. Let's talk a little bit about organizational change management, because this is just as vital. Being able to have an integration planning process where we're doing discovery, where we're working with the other parties in the company we're acquiring to do planning, how we're looking at execution, looking at not only new ways to work together, but also potentially even involving how IT as itself is approaching different problems. This is a great opportunity to look at that and look at your processes as you're working with a new organization as well. Here's a sample integration process. As you can see along the left-hand side, you've got a first 30 days activities. You're getting into security controls. Along the bottom, you're doing the planning, the workshops, you're looking at dependencies, you're building out the integration plan, and then over in the upper right corner, that's when you're doing the cutovers, you're doing the actual integration work as well. This is a great example to be able to workflow how integration works at 10,000 feet, kind of like what we showed on that previous slide as well. But one thing to always keep in mind, we always think this is a great opportunity to execute, and we always think that everything is going to go perfectly. Not right. So it's always, we want to be mindful on why organizational change management is important, because while we might think something is fine, the whole world may be up in flames around us. So, we want to make sure we don't miss anything in discovery to cause the project to be delayed, that we have clearly defined roles between not only IT, but also, partners like concurrency, and being able to ensure that we're all on the same page of who's doing what to avoid any delays, making sure that all the right parties have the right level of access, ensuring that migration tools were set up properly to avoid any sort of rework. List management, we'll talk about a little bit at the end. It's painful, and we've got a way that we're looking to eliminate that with all future M&As, and we'll show you that here in just a little bit. Ensuring that there is not misalignment between even IT and internal departments or vendors with regards to timelines and expectations. That can lead to frustration and any delays in the project. And throughout that we're keeping open lines of communication, making sure that between IT users and partners, we are straightforward and what the communication schedules look like, how we're going to communicate to end users. And then as sometimes even aggressive timelines can lead to frustration as well. You have things like holidays, PTO. We've worked with a lot with customers who have European counterparts, where usually the months of July and August is very difficult to get anything done in Europe with regards to M&As, since everyone's on holiday. So keeping that in mind as you're looking at larger M&A schedules is very important. And having some of those aggressive timelines can delay the project. So keeping that in mind of things that could go wrong gives us an opportunity to then have awareness of how we can plan for things to go smoothly and effectively. So I'm going to show you a series of 3 slides. So this one really is, well, as we worked with a customer, what awareness is from a timeline perspective around combined work streams, because not only do you have the migration of your collaboration, but then you also have, how do we want to effectively plan out what the user impact is going to be, what the migration waves are going to look like, how do we communicate that to different departments and teams, and being able to give them the ability to communicate through things like a town hall, an impact document. And then as we go through and actually do the migration waves, we then are able to engage in that concept of hypercare and learn from any issues, evolve the process. Very little are these processes static from end to end. Usually as we are going through not only unit testing and pilot testing, but the first few waves, there are lessons learned about the environment that you may have not had any clue about that we want to use and adopt into that process. So looking at it from an overall program perspective, and then really how do we look at it from that end user impact? How do we communicate to them? This is a really effective way to kind of look at that migration pre-work, that T-minus countdown, as you can see from the very far left on that Monday, T-minus 14 all the way through T-minus 0, and how we support that end user. There's a lot of communication that's involved, and making sure that we are engaging in presentations that the user can attend to, town halls, giving them emails of what is to be expected, and then documentation, if they choose to read it, that they can go be aware on the process. So that's one struggle that we've found with processes, not only M&As, but migrations altogether. How do we become more effective in successfully reaching out to the end user so they're aware of what's occurring and getting ahead of that, so there's no surprises on the day of migration, that they knew they were supposed to do a migration, but A, they were on vacation, B, they were out of town, C, their computer was off. I could keep going. So that's where communication and engagement is very important, and being able to spell out to the end users what is their experience going to look like? Being able to give them user guides and town halls so they can ask questions, sending them out emails to let them know, hey, this is what you need to do to be able to go through this process. It's going to take X amount of time. This is what's going to change. Once that has occurred, this is what you need to do to be able to log into your environment, to be able to access old applications. And then once you have migrated, how you can leverage, whatever tools to be able to show that day one experience and being able to log into your applications as well. And with all of that communication, a solid support strategy is very important. So not only for what your user can do if they have an issue, how they can send a ticket in, how they can reach out to your first tier support, but if your first tier support runs into an issue that wasn't documented into FAQ, how can they reach out through Teams Bridge or through an email or through a phone call and know who they can reach out to log any issues, who they can reach out for to have support documentation and know who's and what leads either on your side within IT in that source environments or that source organization that old co IT can use for support, or even how to reach out for partners. A support strategy is really important. And then as we've talked about that plan, we've talked about organizational change management. How do we execute that from a toolset perspective? What have we found a concurrency that has helped us to be successful in these M&A projects? Looking at it from that day zero perspective and being platform agnostic, there are some things we can do from organization, relationships, and Outlook to mail flow connectors, planning for that user engagement. That doesn't necessarily mean creating a plethora of guest accounts or contacts in that target Active Directory and that Spinco environment, because that'll lead to rework, that'll lead to cleanup, that'll lead to frustration. So being mindful on day one what to do and what not to do technology wise is really important. Early on, I talked about the tool sets. We looked at Microsoft, we looked at Quest. I wanted to kind of give this as an illustration of what Microsoft can do today. There are some great tools that they have that are available that are maturing that I think one day will be able to stand toe to toe to third-party competitors. But as you can see on the right side, there are a number of things that it can't do. You can't move permissions and files with SharePoint. There is some pre-work that has to be done with Exchange, and you have to have a very specific use case where this type of migration for email will be successful. In a lot of cases, you have organizations that have certain VIPs that want to be able to start emailing out day one. And sure, you could leverage things like domain rewrite, but that doesn't really give them the ability to get into a mailbox and start to be able to collaborate from day one. In that Microsoft scenario, that's really hard to do, if not impossible. And with OneDrive, it's being treated as a third-party tool almost. You have to get licensing, you have to have an EA, you have to have the right part number, you have to work with an account manager to be able to turn those features on to be able to do that OneDrive migration. So it is painful, which is why we usually look at a third-party tool. Yes, there are some licensing costs that are up front, but it has flexibility for being able to license who you need to migrate. It has maturity for quickly being able to onboard users and execute, and then supportability, being able to reach out to not only Quest, but also partner like Concurrency, that it has those war stories, that it has those deep knowledge-based documents on when certain things come up, how to work through them really quickly. There's something to be said about that level of maturity and flexibility that allows for you to be able to support a migration a lot easier. And the setup is super easy. You connect tenants. The discovery is easy. It actually goes out and looks at all the users, groups, a number of different things within your collaboration environment, SharePoint sites, team sites, and then allows you to quickly be able to match accounts, provision new team sites, SharePoint sites, allows you to copy all the data over, to remap the permissions from the old environment to the same user and the same groups in the new environment behind the scenes. There's really not a whole lot you have to do once you kick off those tasks. And Quest is making a lot of investment to make the process easier, faster, be able to do pre-discovery reports to look at what to expect before you run and actually execute these discovery tasks. And Collaboration is one half of one of the biggest work streams within an M&A. The other is in user compute. That's where we leverage the Quest ODMAD, which is their on-demand Active Directory toolset. That's the one that synchronizes your user accounts between tenants. That syncs your groups and keeps the memberships intact. It even synchronizes your password. It synchronizes your SID history, and it does all this without having to deploy a server and infrastructure. It allows it to communicate up to port 443 securely on the web to receive those orchestration commands, and allows you to have one console to be able to migrate your devices and be able to go through these time of migration steps with some level of orchestration, versus doing a reset in all the tasks that are involved with setting up a new user's device from scratch or having to field support calls to migrate them. It does that all pretty effortlessly, and it actually supports the ability to migrate your devices from on-premise AD in the source to Azure AD in the target. So, Microsoft will come back and say, this is a non-supported migration flow. They want you to do a reset or a rebuild. But in a lot of cases, our customers say, do no harm. By doing a reset, that's harmful to the end user. It's very impactful. So having a tool that can do this with very little end user impact or downtime is very important. And then on the day one is easier as well, where the user logs in after their machine has been migrated. They run the desktop agent, they put in their credentials, it converts their Outlook profile, it updates their Office license, it connects their OneDrive and starts it to sync back down, as well as being able to set up their credentials within Teams. Then they are able to continue to move on with their normal day-to-day responsibilities. So we're getting near the end of the presentation. We talked through the planning, we talked through organizational change management, we talked about the tool sets, but one of the keys, and if you remember back to the "this is fine" slide and some of the other illustrations that came by way of this presentation, it all boils down to transparency and issue resolution, and knowing that these processes, I think, as we like to hear be called, get a little crunchy. These projects definitely can get crunchy between not only the source environment, the old code, the spin code, the integration partner. Being transparent that there are going to be issues and that we want to make sure those lines of communications are open is important. And having that mindset, preparedness, means setting that expectations. It means if you had the choice between doing something fast or doing something right, you can't have both within these projects. We've talked to many customers over the course of the last 5 or 6 years to do these projects, and it's very important to keep in mind that there's a lot of decisions that are needed for this to go smoothly, and that having that transparency is important. And another reason why rushing can be dangerous, this was a use case with one of our customers where they wanted to have that new environment, but they wanted to do it very rapidly. And so having that ability to communicate to them, how do we communicate to users to let them know they only need this email, this credential for this app and this credential for email, and then it becomes really confusing. It doesn't give us the time to be able to communicate that impact with short timelines, and why rushing can be dangerous, because not only do we not have time to effectively communicate to users, it can leave a bad taste in their mouth, and it can leave a bad taste into leadership's minds about that experience. So we not having the ability to timely communicate the impact can be dangerous. And instead of this being looked at as an event that occurred throughout the experience at a company, in being a non-event, you don't want it to be a very painful event that person takes with them potentially to other organizations, and will leave a scar on your back with how the process went. So that's where we want to be open with leadership, to not undersell the effort, to communicate that it does take time, and to let them know that this is not cheap. It's probably one of the more expensive projects. We've done some math, and $500 to $1,500 per user is not out of the realm of possibility when you consider tools, the process, the actual execution, and it doesn't take into account typically what impact it might have on the end user or your IT department's time as well. So with all these different work streams, keep in mind that it is probably one of the most complex projects you can do within IT. But the plethora of learning and the ability to evolve because of that is important. And being able to take some of those learnings, which we've done here at Concurrency, to help make that process easier. We've learned that the pain of doing migrations really does boil down to effectively knowing who is where and who moves when and where are they going. And it boils down to list management. So, this is not too far off the map of some of the spreadsheets we've seen with some of these M&A projects. I know we've had some horror stories in list management, which is why we've taken that feedback and we've started to develop our own tool, Concurrency Automator, to be able to ingest data from a number of different data sources within the source and target environments so that we can sit down and empower our customers to manage these lists and to change migration waves and doing it real time without having to synchronize a list from here or there, or making sure if someone left or making sure if someone was onboarded that they don't get missed or should not be migrated. And one of the things that now that we've kind of brought it into this beta phase, we're starting to look at the future. How can we set up notifications through email, through a Teams chat, through a pop-up, through Intune? Those are real possibilities. How can we migrate devices, and how can we do some of that wave orchestration is on our roadmap. But really the key, it's account management. How do we know who's there and who do we need to migrate when? And we leverage a lot of that with Power BI dashboards that allows us to pull all this data into about 6 or 7 different reports to be really mindful to see how big mailboxes are, how big OneDrives are, to not be caught off guard with some of the data that might be in an end user's OneDrive, or to see if that user really should be migrated, or if they have an archive, which happens to occur as well. And it gives us the cool capability to leverage reporting for looking to see where we might have some of our hotspots and users based off of that information that exists within that user account and AD. So it does rely a lot on there being correct information in Active Directory, things that we try to look at and correct in the beginning of a project if we can, so that way we have good reporting data. And wanted to kind of show at a high level where a lot of these ingestion points are. So we leverage SQL to pull all these data sources into one place through collector scripts, and then leverage not only the Power BI dashboard that I just showed you to be able to look at that data and kind of spin it around inside of how the Concurrency Migrator app really is front-ended in Power Automate app for a nice UI for end users to be able to access. So where do we go from here? Nate, did you want to drive this one, or do you want me to drive this one, going into kind of what are some best practices to get started with your M&A?
Sure. I mean, I can do it. That sounds good.
Right ahead.
So this is something that we've seen as companies say, wow, like I've got is coming up, or I'm even just looking at my organization and I need to understand how I start encapsulating this within stages of how I even think about this. And one of the things that we've found to be really helpful for organizations is to take that step back, whether you have an existing M&A, or you know that your company is acquisitive, or you simply know that you have you just want to be in a better position as an organization. Take the step back and start thinking about what your ultimate modernized vision is for your organizational tech. Where are you going? What is the horizon plan of your organizational technology as relates to Office 365, collaboration, Azure, etc.? So you know where your end game is. Reason why that's so important is because that becomes where you're pulling your integrated customer into. Like you wouldn't believe the number of times Chris and I have gotten on conversations with customers, and it's like, what are we know we've acquired this organization. Are we bringing them into exactly what you have now? And then you have to do a double move, or are you bringing them into something which is better than what you do now and not having to do the double move. It's the same effort. It's just a question of whether you know where you're going or not. So starting with the idea of a modernization vision associated with your organization, building a strategy for integration surrounding that, and then creating a playbook, not the run book, as Chris said, the playbook of how I'm going to integrate various size of organizations into my business, t-shirt sizing them. 25 users or less, I do this. 100 users or less, I do this. 1,000, 3,000, 2,000, I do this. Merger size, all bets are off, right? And you get to this ability to be able to intake and create a repeatability to how you attack that problem, but you're also much better off for it because you're thinking about it in the context of your own organization where you're taking it. So that's really step one, is thinking about the strategy of how you address this in general. Step two is building a specific plan for an individual M&A. So pulling from that to evaluate and plan that specific intake, using the t-shirt sizing to be able to do this very easily. Like we had a company we were talking to yesterday, like they already know what they're doing with the 25 user or less. They're just doing it. Like it's part of their normal process now. Whereas this bigger company, they're not quite sure how they're going to address it because of all these constraints, and that's part of how they organize their playbook. Start with that planning to execute based on the determination of size and complexity that then allows you to make that active choice. That then leads into number three, which is ultimately executing one, running the M&A based on the playbook and plan, knowing what you're going to do it before you do it. And that efficiency is based on the machine that you built before you get to here. So when you get to this point, like you ultimately go right back to one if you don't have it, because you start to say, I'm going to execute all this stuff. Well, like, what are we doing? What are we executing? How do we do it? And your goal is then to drive efficiency in this stage, either the first time you did it, because you're doing things better than you did before and you know where you're going, or it's the fourth one or the fifth one that you're doing and you've established that repeatability. So if we were going to articulate how we'd love to engage with you afterward, it's to help you with creating those things that you could potentially create yourself, but we can bring many of these assets to the table to help you get going. So we had a conversation with a company yesterday. They want us just to help build their playbook, like help us to understand where we're going strategically and what the playbook is for us to be better at doing not only the integration work, but just where we're going with this piece of our business and our IT infrastructure and thoughts in general. So number one is a great place for us to get started helping you, because it's really a strategic spot where we can be very prescriptive about how you take your strategy forward. Number two, you got to active M&A. Those things hit fast and furious. That's where we've built a lot of competency. If you have one that's active right now, let's talk. Let's help you get that done in a way that leverages your current team and maybe even get some things accomplished along the way. And then number three is actually getting that done. It's capacity. It's like, this the most common question in this is, who's doing it? Like, do you have capacity? If not, let's be honest about that and know what kind of application capacity you can apply so we can meet your goal. And that's part of the conversation of executing these integrations, is really knowing and understanding what that capacity capability is and matching it back to the plan and the strategy that we talked about ahead of time. So as you complete your survey, we want to know what you thought of like the fire hose today. If it was interesting and valuable to you and you want more of it, we have a lot more of these events coming up. So we want to make sure we're learning from what we're doing well and taking advice from what we can do differently. Give us that feedback today, and we'd love to meet with you about some of these calls to action. If you have any additional questions, we'd be happy to take them in the chat, and hang around if you want to hit us with any of those. If not, that's fine too.
Or we think of them later, drop them in the chat. So we've done that with many customers as well, or just drop us an email, and we'd love to help you more.